Good afternoon. I'm Dave Baselinger, formerly a professor of philosophy and ethics here at Roberts and now the chief academic officer. TED Talks are small, focused discussions by experts on issues of current interest. Red Talks are the Roberts TED Talks. And we have 3 Red Talk presenters today, each be presenting for 15 minutes on an issue of interest, and then we'll have 5 minutes of discussion after each. Our first presenter is Matthew Moore, who's been here 20 years. It's hard to believe.
Technically.
Matt is now the Associate Professor of Humanities, and he's half-time in the Department of History, half-time in the Department of Literature and Language, and he's going to be speaking today on what's so important about the arts and humanities. Let's welcome Matt.
Thank you. Yes, I have the distinct privilege of being the Roberts' first and maybe only ever professor of humanities. So it just suits me. If you know me, you know I don't fit really well anywhere. So we've made our own. I've made my own place here. As you've seen with TED Talks, oftentimes people stand in a dark room and it's very dramatic and they have everything memorized. I'm not like that, so I'm going to read, and I hope that that's okay. I'll also interact, and I've got some things for you to see while we go along. Is the sound okay? All right, great. So what's so important about the arts and humanities? I think maybe one of the best ways to do this is to start with an imaginary exercise, just a mental exercise, as Einstein used to do these. So a thought exercise. So just, if you will, with me, imagine a world where there are no baby pictures, right? Where there's no poetry on Valentine's Day, where grieving people never turn to philosophy or scripture for solace. Let's go a little further. Just imagine, if you will, with me, a world where there are no high school musicals, no memes, no hobbits, no TV, no books, no memorials, no period pieces, whether you like Downton Abbey, no Mona Lisa, no films, no Beatles, no Taj Mahal, no crossword puzzles, yay, no, Narnia, inspirational speeches, holidays, or the Bible, and you get the idea, right? Just imagine that for a moment. So what's so important about the arts and humanities? This is the question I bring before us today. So what are we talking about when we mention the arts and humanities? Well, here are some of the things. At least in our school, there are 6 different disciplines, 6 different departments, and we study and celebrate all these things. So it's history, and literature, and communication, religion and philosophy, visual arts, and music, and the performing arts. So in these fields, the following ideas and experiences are essential. It's what we do. So love, worship, expression, critical thinking, imagination, creativity, storytelling, reading fast, humor, meaning, transcendence, wisdom, emotional intelligence, and empathy. You can find these in all these other disciplines across campus. You can find empathy in psychology and nursing. You can find critical thinking in biology, but they are squarely at home in the arts and humanities. It's what we do. It's our reason for being. But the question arises, it's here, it's the elephant in the room, we might as well let the elephant toot its snout. Can these help you get a job? So I'm going to address that, I think, as systematically as I can. Let's take this first one as if it's a rational question. It's also possible that it's, I would say entirely possible that it is also an absurd question. So let's take the rational question first. Let's just treat it with dignity and respect and try to talk about that. So can these get you a job? As former director of the arts and humanities at Penn State, Michael Berube has noted, despite lots of talk about the arts and humanities dying off academically, professionally, and culturally, they have been surprisingly resilient over the past 70 years, surviving a massive overhaul to favor the so-called hard sciences during the Cold War, the academic turmoil of the 1960s, and by the growing emphasis on technocracy in the 50 years since. Are the arts and humanities endangered? No. Are they embattled? Yes, very much so. Can the arts and humanities get you a job? Well, let's take a look at one academic study. So this speaks to people who might need, quantifiable data if that speaks to you in a way that some of these other warm, fuzzy things don't. So there was an academic study out of Oxford University that about 5 years ago that tallied up 700 types of jobs and ranked them by the likelihood that those jobs would be computerized. I culled from this data the 30 types of jobs that are directly connected to our fields of study. So here they are. So this is my selection. I went through all 700 and tried to select any of those that seemed somehow directly related to what we study here in those 6 departments. And many of these make sense, right? You can see a direct correlation between what we teach and a profession here. I even added these, some of which few people really participate in. And the way that this works, the study works, is the closer to 0%, the least likely it's going to be computerized. Closer to 100%, the greater the likelihood that they're going to be computerized. So you see, motion picture projectionist is 97%. They're already being replaced by computers. So when you go to see a movie, oftentimes it's just a machine up there. So on the other hand, a choreographer, 0.4%, less than 1% likelihood. It's really hard to have a computer teach you how to dance, in other words, right? So putting all this together, I think we can notice a few interesting things here. So I put this together on a chart so you can assess this. And you see there's a very high, or very, very low probability that this will ever happen. Just for fun, and to create a comparison with my friends over in business, I thought I'd pick on the business people for a moment. And so I counted up somewhere around 100, maybe a little bit over, of the types of jobs that are somehow directly connected to business. And I put those in comparison to these. As you can see, there's a very high likelihood that many of these business-related professions and fields, jobs, will be or are being replaced by computers. So for example, one of the highest ranking ones for business was telemarketer. Machines already do that, right? One that surprised me was accounting. Don't tell Dan Barlow that, but there's a very high likelihood that that will become computerized in our lifetime. And of the ones that are not likely to be computerized, there are very, very few of those. Right? So if we look at that, business jobs are highly computerizable. I don't know if that's a word, but I'm using it. And then by comparison, of course, almost all the arts and humanities jobs are nearly impossible to computerize. So while only 4 to 5% of all jobs, humanities jobs, there are only 30 types of jobs, 4 to 5% of all the total 700 ones. They're very, very resilient. So can the arts and humanities get you a job? Yes. And we could ask the following question to these people, who by all accounts are financially successful, if we must use finances as a significant measure of success, which we do not have to. And by the way, all of these successful people were English majors. We've heard a lot about how you can't do anything with an English degree, and ask these people what you can do with that. I don't know what their grades were or if they even graduated. I think a couple of them kind of got by. But we don't have time to list all the successful history and communication and religion and philosophy and visual arts and performing arts majors. That would take an hour just to list those. And it's not just employment that the arts and humanities are helpful with. How about inspiring a global business and technological revolution? Yes, that's right. Star Trek has changed the world. So you know the story, right? That Kirk's transponder there, we know, was the inspiration for, remember this? The flip phone. We know that the designers of the flip phone were inspired by Star Trek, and they wanted to replicate that. They thought that would be pretty cool. Fiction has changed the world. And this is just one of many, many examples. It's just unthinkable to have a world without cell phones now and that kind of technology. That's just quite amazing. So as Nicholas Carr points out, who visited here maybe 10 years ago, our neural pathways have actually been rewired due to the emergence of cell phone culture. Ironically, Studies are showing how the pervasiveness of cell phones is correlated to our culture's diminished aptitude for concentration, cognition, creativity, productivity, and empathy as human beings. And guess what? Studies are showing that the arts and humanities, reading literature, or singing in an ensemble, for example, there have been studies of both of those, can help reverse those negative effects as well. And then there are the experiences like theater of war, a drama therapy project created by Brian Doriez. Since 9/11, more than 2.7 million Americans have been deployed into theaters of military conflict, 2.7 million. 60% of them suffer from some mental health issues, and 40% have contemplated suicide. In the Theater of War project, actors perform ancient Greek tragedies like Ajax, which was written by Sophocles, who himself was a general, for thousands of veterans all over the country, and to help bring about catharsis, much as the ancient Greeks did for their armies 2,500 years ago. This is a practice that they did. They read drama, they performed drama for their soldiers. After one performance of Theater of War, one actor recalled that a young American soldier in the audience delivered a card to the actor that read, "I had been entertaining thoughts of suicide. Thank you for saving my life." So you can see by glancing at the values that are intrinsic to the arts and humanities, the question, can the arts and humanities get you a job, could strike one as the most absurd question one could ask. And while, again, speaking to these people as well, and while Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you've seen this before, I'm sure, if you've been in higher education or education at all, you've seen this. And while Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that higher experiences of self-actualization seen in the arts and humanities can only be achieved after our most basic needs are met, food and water, for example, how can we account for the counterintuitive way that singular works of beauty and art can be created by writers, artists, and thinkers, while at the same time suffering from poverty and starvation, like South American writer Feliz Alberto Hernandez, for example, among many. As one apocryphal sermon, paraphrased, goes, one cannot live for more than 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, or 3 minutes without hope. One of the things that the arts and humanities can cultivate is hope. The arts and humanities, I submit to you, are not ancillary to human experiences, extraneous and sometimes pleasant amusements, as it were, but they're central to the human experience, and their absence diminishes all. Without a good knowledge of global history, for example, you would not know that some of the things we think of as fundamentally modern or Western, in fact, originate in the Arabic world. This is an example. Any of you coffee drinkers? Coffee, eyeglasses, hospitals, syringes, forceps, sutures, algebra, the guitar. Just imagine pop music without the guitar. And even some of our Christian theological principles were taken from our neighbors in the Muslim world. We were able to put men on the moon thanks to Muslim innovations. Our vast cyber world filled with computers and cell phones exists thanks to Indian math. The camera developed thanks to Eurasian trade. The Reformation likely wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the printing press, made in China, with whom we are presently in a trade war. We simply wouldn't be here without the deep interconnectedness of world cultures. And failing to understand these and other important lessons of history makes us more likely to believe we should hide behind a border wall armed with protectionist policies and fueled by nativist fears. Without media literacy, we might be more likely to believe that global warming is a hoax, that record superstorms, unprecedented droughts and wildfires, and increases in global temperature would have happened naturally without the carbon, methane, and other toxic pollution produced by corporations serving 7 billion people. By the way, take a good look. This is a picture of the sovereign state of Maldives. It's a really sort of hot destination for vacationers in the Indian Ocean. Its highest elevation is 6 feet, and it will probably be entirely underwater within 100 years. Without effective critical thinking skills, it's more likely to discount or disbelieve that the spike of 1,000 earthquakes in 2015 in the state of Oklahoma is actually being caused by fracking and similar induced drilling. For that matter, we would lose the capacity to imagine and develop real-life, even lucrative, alternatives to fossil fuel consumption, which is steadily killing the richness of our habitable world. Without a deep understanding and application of the performing arts, our abilities to express ourselves, enhance our relationships, to listen, creatively problem solve and collaborate, develop alternatives, and appreciate God's creation would be critically diminished. Not only would we be diminished workers, we'd be diminished human beings. Without the empathy as that developed from religion and philosophy, it is more likely that we will treat the poor, the homeless, the diseased, the disabled, the abused, the criminals, and the marginalized without the kindness, respect, dignity, sympathy, and magnanimity that Jesus Christ has shown us. Without empathy, we are more likely to support policies that allow torture and inflict violence on others, much as the Roman state did 2,000 years ago. Without empathy, we are more likely to support policies that treat refugees who are fleeing persecution, like Mary and Joseph, with judgment and suspicion, and even hate. Our American democracy depends on a population that, as President Porterfield likes to say, connects the heart with the head and the hands. Without meaningful enrichment by the arts and humanities, the leadership of the most powerful country will be elected by a population whose capacities for thought and feeling as human beings are seriously compromised. If we believe absurdities, Voltaire said, we will commit atrocities. So what's so important about the arts and humanities? Everything. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I'll bring you the mic because this is being... Oh, just a second.
Okay.
It's being taped.
Yes.
Does anyone know the founder of YouTube went to IUP, where I'm from, Indiana, Pennsylvania? Do you know what he transferred from computer programming to?
I don't know. No.
Art.
Art.
Art
Fantastic.
and
right.
humanities. He transferred. He just a few years ago sold his. This is a conservative estimate. His partnership in that for $1.5 billion. Just thought I'd say.
As a humanities person, I don't even know how to understand those numbers. You know, it's too high for me.
But anyways, I just thought I'd throw that out there.
That's interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Another question?
Wow. We should put that on like the poster, you know, for arts and humanities, something like that. I will. I'll Google it. I'll YouTube it. There we go. Excellent. Yeah. Good. Any thoughts or criticisms, questions, funny jokes you want to share? Anything like that?
If not,
Here's one.
I'm an elementary school teacher, and so I'm wondering what is your perspective, or do you have any ideas of how to bring some of those principles of arts and humanities into the classroom, just from your experience?
Oh yeah, that's like the easiest question, I would say, because there's so many things you could do, right? Children are already, you ask any child, can you draw? And of course they'll say yes. You ask an adult, can you draw? And only those select few who maybe are art majors will say that, right? So they're open, they love these things. It's part of their world. So I would include, you know, anything that you feel appropriate. Art, music, you know, science is, believe it or not, I'm not trying to slam science at all. I love science. Children are scientists. They wonder, they ask questions. You know, they don't always want the answers. They want to kind of engage with it. And that's consistent with the arts and humanities as well, exploring. So there are lots of things you could do. Yeah. Great. Thanks.
let's thank Matthew again for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Kristen Driscoll. Kristen's been with us 3 years. She's an assistant professor of education and director of our very popular Pathway to Teaching program. Kristen's topic will be how best to prepare teacher candidates for today's classroom. Let's welcome Kristen.
Thank you. I want everybody to think back for a minute. Do you remember learning how to swim? Go ahead, close your eyes if you need to. But think back. Were you thrown right into the water? and expected to be able to swim? I really hope not, right? You probably, whether you took classes or not, you probably first were like held by an adult, and then you kind of graduated to holding onto the side of the pool, and then maybe you had those little water swimmy things or a noodle, and then eventually you were able to swim all by yourself, right? I hope. Okay, tuck that memory away for a minute. Now I want to tell you a story. There once was a girl named Sally. Sally was a teacher education major at a highly respected teacher preparation program. All throughout her program, Sally just shined. She mastered the art of lesson planning. She soaked up everything she could when she was out doing field work. She even spent her free time making flashcards, cutting out little shapes, laminating things. I mean, you get my drift. So when Sally graduated, she was confident. She felt fully prepared for whatever it was she was going to encounter. So Sally got her first job in the city. She went and set up her classroom the day before school started, as that often happens with a new job. And then the next day, kids came in, and Sally felt prepared, but for the hypothetical. Once real kids were in front of her, Sally encountered things that she had never really thought about. Academic things, behavior things, school things, I mean, you name it. She went through her whole first year of teaching, realizing that while her teacher preparation program gave her a great foundation of knowledge, and she was able to practice putting theory into practice here and there, nothing truly prepared her to walk into that classroom. So that was 20 years ago. Flash forward to a classroom in 2018. Class sizes are bigger, right? Resources are more scarce. There's way more diversity in terms of needs in classrooms. The pressure around standardized testing and teacher accountability, kind of huge, right? Those rigorous standards, right? I wonder how Sally would feel now, right? I think that we can all agree that there are just some things you can't be prepared for until you're in your own classroom, responsible for your own group of students. But we can certainly try, right? I think that rather than operating in a silo, teacher preparation programs really need to partner with K-12 settings in very authentic ways to prepare teacher candidates to just walk right into the workforce in a very seamless way. It's just like you wouldn't teach, say, a 3-year-old to swim by reading about it, showing a video, maybe modeling it a little bit, and then boom, they're ready to swim. Probably not, right? There's a bit of a gradual release there, or learning by doing. Well, we have to do the same thing with pre-service teachers as well. I believe there are 3 things teacher education programs need to integrate in order to really prepare teacher candidates for the rigors of teaching. And I believe we're doing all three of those things here at Roberts, so let's dig into them. Let's think about current classrooms. What are big things that teachers deal with on a daily basis? I'd say we'd start with the standards. Probably sounds familiar. If you're a teacher, you hear start with the standards all the time, right? If you're not a teacher, you probably have heard about standards out in the media, whether good or bad, you've heard about them, right? Well, standards are much more rigorous and ever evolving, but they should be. As society changes, we need to change our standards for our students. Right now, literacy standards are at the heart of what every teacher does. It doesn't matter grade level, content area, everyone has fully embraced, hopefully, the literacy standards. Well, then those same literacy standards should be found throughout the coursework in any teacher preparation program, right? So one of the best ways we've equipped our teacher candidates is not only do we integrate the literacy standards, but we teach them why we have these standards. We teach them about the background of the standards, the call for the current focus on literacy, the drive behind the standards movement right now. We can't expect teacher candidates to be advocates for students and for quality teaching if they don't really understand all of those things, right? So really making sure teacher candidates understand the background of the standards, super important. I think we've begun to do this well in our coursework. Students have plenty of opportunities to work with those literacy standards throughout all of their courses. But actually, as we begun to make this movement and we dug a little bit deeper, we noticed that teacher candidates seeking childhood certification were struggling to teach math. Well, why wouldn't they? When were they learning about the math standards, right? We wouldn't go to a third grade teacher and say, here, teach this third grade math, but I'm not going to train you on the third grade standards. But we can't do the same to our teacher candidates either. So we noticed this and we shifted. I actually took the entire content of a full course and shifted it from the literacy standards to the math standards for that purpose. What I think is key, though, is when I'm teaching students about the standards, I use materials from the state education department, materials used in professional development sessions with teachers right now. Why wouldn't I? Wouldn't I want our teacher candidates to be familiar with the content, the vocabulary, the materials that teachers are doing right now so they could literally walk into a building and be confident? Makes sense, right? Okay, what's another thing teachers deal with on a daily basis? I'd say diversity is a big one. Diverse needs in classrooms. That's something that just continues to grow. It doesn't matter the grade level, the school district. We have a huge range in diverse needs. So teacher candidates can very easily learn a textbook definition of differentiated instruction or universal design for learning. I see teachers smirking. But planning lessons for hypothetical classes doesn't really get at that level of being able to take a whole classroom full of students with a wide variety of needs and planning lessons that address all of those needs. I can tell you firsthand, nothing prepared me for that. My first year of teaching, I struggled daily to plan instruction, grade level instruction, for students who are reading on 4 to 5 different grade levels. That's very challenging. So how can we bridge that gap? Well, we can give our teacher candidates access to real students, right? That's what real teachers do every day. One of my most favorite course assignments is I give my teacher candidates a stack of math exit tickets from a real third grade classroom. And they have to go through it, analyze it, make some instructional decisions, and then create an action plan. Usually our teacher candidates love it because they love looking at real student work with their little quirks in their handwriting. But I like to take it one step further. I then take my teacher candidates to that third grade classroom, and they actually get to practice teaching one of those lessons to real kids. There is nothing better than teaching to children. I mean, teaching to your peers in a college classroom, it's good practice, but kind of not the same as a third grader looking at you like, what are you talking about, right? Again, it's the work that real teachers do on a daily basis. So why wouldn't we do that with our pre-service teachers, right? Okay, let's think of one more major issue teachers deal with on a daily basis. I'd say management is a biggie, and that's kind of all-encompassing. Behavior management, time management, managing responsibilities, managing many district and school initiatives. I mean, I could probably go on and on here. But these are the kinds of things that you really can't learn in a college classroom. They really need to be learned on the ground in real time. So why can't we move the college classroom to a K-12 setting? If we did that, then our teacher candidates are going to see all of those management needs being addressed in real time. That's the thinking behind our moving our secondary methods course to Greece Athena High School. I teach it on site at Athena, so our teacher candidates learn not only from me, but from the principal and from the teachers working with those students every single day. It's just so authentic. Our teacher candidates learn using district materials. They learn current trends in professional development because they attend all of those sessions with their master teacher, and they get to practice. What teacher candidates usually get to do is engage in these really rich experiences while student teaching. But why would we save all that rich experience just for the last 14 weeks of a program? They should be engaged in those rich experiences throughout their whole 4 years of a program, right? I have to say, we usually get really good feedback from our teacher candidates who take this course because they feel so confident. They actually get to spend a whole year with that master teacher. So the course happens in the fall, and then ideally they student teach in the spring with that same master teacher. So confidence is sky high. They already know their master teacher and their teaching style. They know the students and their wide variety of needs. They know the district curricular materials because they had a ton of assignments they had to do for me using those materials. They know current trends or current initiatives around professional development because they sit through it. In fact, they are this coming Monday, my students right now. It's just so authentic. And not only that, but the principal and the teachers at Athena love this experience because they feel vested in working with us to prepare pre-service teachers, as they should. That's where our pre-service teachers are ultimately going to go. I'm really proud of the work we've done here at Roberts. These three things: training teacher candidates like teachers, giving teacher candidates access to real students, and moving the college classroom into a K-12 setting gives them such great experience. Again, while they do all of these wonderful things in student teaching, it shouldn't be reserved only for the end of the program. Student teaching should be a time where they're fully comfortable because they've already practiced all of these things in a very supported way throughout. Gone are the days of planning lessons for hypothetical classes of students or imaginary students, or teaching about learning and teaching in a silo. I mean, that's not how other professions prepare novices, right? Could you imagine if med school, they only worked on like simulations before going and working with real patients? Unsupervised? Yikes, right? Why would we do that to children? So these shifts we've made and are continuing to make are truly impacting our teacher candidates. I can't tell you how impressed I am with how different our student teachers are. They walk into student teaching with a level of confidence that I hadn't really seen before. They engage in student teaching way earlier, meaning they don't wait a few weeks to just observe. They actually are teaching lessons in their first week of their placement. Plus, they're able to talk with district administrators and teachers in a really current and informed way. And what that does actually is make local administrators keep their eyes on our teacher candidates. So when positions open up, they tap us to say, hey, I'm looking for a so-and-so. Powerful, right? Just like you wouldn't throw a 3-year-old into water and say, here you go, learn how to swim. We really can't throw a newly graduated teacher into their first classroom and expect them to be highly effective. So again, these three things: training teacher candidates like teachers, giving teacher candidates access to students, and moving the college classroom into K-12 settings. Those are the three best things we can possibly do to set our teacher candidates up to seamlessly walk into the workforce and positively impact children. Thank you.
Questions or comments?
Do I get a second chance? If you wait till I get out of this one. Honestly, I just can't wait to ask this question. How in the world of college assessment of students, college students, do you have a rubric, or how do you assess the progress for getting credits and so forth for the students? How do you assess your candidates? I remember how I was, but how do you do that?
I mean, there are a lot of different ways. Obviously, when they're student teaching, we have a very detailed student teaching rubric, so we're measuring them on things. Yeah.
Okay.
On many different points about teaching, instructing, assessing, management. But then we take all of those pieces of the rubric and sprinkle them throughout our classes as well. So in a planning class, they're being assessed on a rubric using the same language as that student teaching rubric.
When I did my school counseling intern and student teaching, I got 1 credit for that.
Huh.
And
Wow.
do you give generous credits for these, I hope?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you don't have to answer that.
Yes. Well, all they do in one semester is student teach.
Good. Okay.
So that's where all their credits come from.
I'm done. I want you to think about that.
How do you feel about, because there's different ways to do this, like integrated placements. So like lab schools within an institution, or bringing that into, as a program, into the public space which one have you found is more effective in the research you've done and your own personal experience?
That's a great question. I actually had, before I was here, I was an instructional coach, and I was able to work in like a lab, classroom kind of setting. That's wonderful too, because anytime real students are in front of teacher candidates, obviously, that's valuable. But there's still a big piece missing when it's like a lab classroom on a college campus. You don't get any of that other stuff that they need to see in terms of working together with other teachers in the grade level, or how they support one another through, intervention strategies, or, issues with management. You obviously don't really have any management issues when you just have one little class, one little time a day. So I think, again, they're both great, but I think it is far better to take the college students over to a real P12 setting.
One last question or comment? Let's thank Kristen again. Our last presenter is Beth Gerhart. Beth has been with us 16 years at the college and the seminary. She's now professor of theology and social ethics at Northeastern Seminary. Her topic is 5 lessons Dietrich Bonhoeffer for the church today. Let's welcome Beth.
Thank you. Thanks. My daughter advised me be funny, and then I told her the topic, and she's like, oh, so it's not funny. But I said to her, I hope it's interesting, because this is an area of great interest to me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for those of you not familiar with who he is, his years are 1904 to 1945. He was a German pastor, Lutheran theologian. He was a poet, often people are surprised by that. He's also was a leader in ecumenical efforts, really active during the 1920s, 1930s period. He was also a co-conspirator in a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler. And ultimately, he was jailed not for his theology or his church work. He was jailed because of his involvement with this conspiracy. He was in 1945, in April 1945, he was murdered by the Nazis. He was hung. He was active, particularly in global efforts to awaken the world to what was going on in Germany. He started out by being a pastor in Barcelona and also a youth pastor. And he had said, had the war not happened, this crisis not occurred, he would have been very happy to stay in a parish and working with youth. One of the reasons I'm very passionate about the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is the important prophetic role that he played in the church of his day, but also I think for us today. What I said to a class this week, actually, and what I'm very interested in always is a so what question. I'm not very interested in reading theology just to read theology, but what can we learn from theology? What can we learn from church history for the work of the church today? So I have 5 lessons, and because of time, I wrote this, actually started writing it before I knew I only had 15 minutes. So I'm going to move quickly through the first 2, and I want to focus primarily on the last 3. But the first one, I think one blends into the other and is really foundational for the others. But the first one is the question that he posed to the church of his time, which is a Christological question: who is Jesus Christ for us today? He was calling the church back to this question really from the early church, right? The Christological controversies of those days, and back to the question again at different times during church history that people wrestle with, and theologians and the church needs to wrestle with. Who is Jesus Christ for us? Now, for Dietrich's time, Jesus was the one that the German Christians and the Nazis also proclaimed as God. And the confessing church, which developed as a group of church people concerned about what was happening in Germany and feeling the larger German Christian church was not addressing it, the confessing church said, wait a minute, the identity of Jesus, our Jesus, has to do with the one who also cares for the marginalized and the poor, and is in solidarity with those who are persecuted, right? And so is Jesus the one who proclaims political and worldly power, or is he the one that calls us to give up all and die to ourselves? Is he the one who banishes, actually, Satan with the temptations of fame, power, and domination? So this central question of Bonhoeffer is important because the Christological question leads to our question having to do with the mission of the church, right? What's then the mission of the church in the world today? If we can discern as a community body or as a church body who is this Jesus Christ? Who is it that we say we follow? What does that mean, discipleship? That will help us to figure out then what are we to do in the world, if anything. So for Bonhoeffer, he talks about Christology, who this Jesus is, as a point of departure. He uses that language, point of departure for mission. And I think it's a beautiful way of integrating spirituality and Christology, ecclesiology, and ultimately mission. So it is Christ and his work in the world that works on us, right, to transform us and lead us into the world then to do mission. Rather than, as some were arguing in his time, and perhaps the lesson is for our time, that it's political ideology, or it's our morality, it's our good works, it's that, our judgments, that then leads us out, or our opinions to mission. The second lesson has to do with realism. His understanding of the church's role in relationship with reality. Bonhoeffer was part of a school of theology often called the Neo-Orthodox school. Sometimes you'll see it titled the Crisis Movement, theological movement. Also, you might find it as called the theology of realism. And Karl Barth, Reinhold Niebuhr, also theologians who fall into this school of thought. And it's basically the call to the church to cease being detached from the world on one side, but also warns about the collapse of the church into culture, being so immersed into culture that one then loses a prophetic voice to speak right truth to power. He, in his time, talks about how the church has fallen into this trap of not being engaged in a dialectical relationship with the reality around them, the world around them. On one end, he said, some of my brothers and sisters have become so quietist. They have been detached from the political reality of the day. And so you'll go to, and he wrote one of my favorite sermons of his. It happened after he gave, right after the church election sermons, where Hitler said, wait a minute, only certain people can be, he took some of the bishops out of their position and put his own people in there, and Bonhoeffer's response was this very powerful, beautiful sermon where he warns the church and says, you are ignoring the reality of what is happening here. You are detaching, what we call detached confessionalism. You come to church every week, right? You listen to the preaching. And the preaching wasn't outlawed by Hitler because there was no need to outlaw it. It was not a threat to the power. So that was one problem, he said, you church people have, is you're not engaged. And there were many of his time said, yeah, we don't like Hitler, but we'll just kind of bide our time. He'll lose power. We have to preserve the church. We don't want to get in trouble, right? So that was one school of thought. The other was to collude with Hitler, to say, yeah, we kind of buy into what he's saying. Hitler came out and said, doesn't the scripture say you must obey government? Well, God put me in this place, so to be obedient to God, you must be obedient to me. This was popular teaching. Many well-known biblical scholars, which that's a whole other area I don't have time to go into, even went as far as to say, yeah, the Old Testament, that really shouldn't be a part of our scriptures. Any sayings of Jesus that sound Jewish We need to pull those out, right? So there was a great deal of collusion and teaching going on that Bonhoeffer identified is not Christian teaching and certainly not in keeping with being the Church of Jesus Christ. So this dialectical relationship with the world was very central, and I think a central lesson for us today. There was a real seduction. Hitler was pretty wily. A real seduction in language that Hitler used around family values. I had the privilege of studying down at the Holocaust Museum and seeing an exhibit that they took 5 years to put together. It was very, very powerful, a visual exhibit, and using the language of Hitler throughout that. By the end of it, you're like, wow, I get it. Because it was the language of family values. I'm bringing this back to Germany. It was the German motherhood. You know, beautiful pictures, photos of German women nursing their babies, being at home. Look at what I'm going to bring back. It sounded very Christian, but it was antithetical, of course, to the gospel of Jesus. The third lesson has to do with love. So, for Bonhoeffer, the love of the human, the worth of human dignity, right? The worth of each person was central. He studied in New York for a time. Actually, he was in New York twice and took a class with Reinhold Niebuhr. But during that time, he had friends who were African Americans, and he was not very impressed with the mainline churches in America. And they brought him to some of their churches in Harlem, and that's where he liked to worship. It resonated with him, their perspective around racism in America, and it resonated with him because of what was happening, of course, in his own country. And he talked about what was at the heart of the persecution of both the Jews and the African Americans in America was the same. It was fear, and also there's a thirst for power and domination. And so he promoted radical love, not as piety, not as morality, not as sentiment, or having the right theology or doctrine, and not political ideology. Love was a commitment to the work of God's mission in the world through the power of God's grace. Love is engagement in the work of reconciliation and restoration. He wrote a book about it called, some of you might be familiar with it, The Cost of Discipleship, talking about the difference between cheap grace and costly grace. And that love is also not confined to individuals. It also needs to be a part of our approach to institutions. And so here he picks up on Niebuhr's thought regarding approximate love as justice, social justice, that we might not get to, or we cannot kind of achieve this utopian understanding of love in our institutions, right? But we can promote social justice and be involved in that. And that, he said, is corporate, a form of corporate love. And so for Bonhoeffer, success in this is not the number of people in your pews or political power, but it's really measured in the extent in which the church is faithful to God's mission. How well do we care for the marginalized, the oppressed, the ones who are rejected in power? One of my favorite quotes from Bonhoeffer. The church confesses she has not proclaimed often and clearly enough her message of the one God who has revealed himself for all times in Jesus Christ and who suffers no other gods besides himself. She confesses her timidity, her evasiveness, her dangerous concessions. She's often been untrue to her office of guardianship and to her office of comfort. And through this, she is often denied to the outcast and to the despised the compassion which she owes them. She was silent when she should have cried out because the blood of the innocent was crying aloud to heaven. She has failed to speak the right word in the right way at the right time. And she has not resisted to the uttermost the apostasy of faith, and she has brought upon herself the guilt of the godlessness of the masses. So the failure of the German church and much of the global church was a failure to love, Bonhoeffer said, responsively, to speak up for the Jews and for the persecuted. The fourth lesson then leads into, from love, to his take on evil. In 1982, and you can find this interview in the Holocaust Museum archives online, there was an interview done with Emmy Bonhoeffer, who was Dietrich's sister-in-law. A very fascinating interview, hour-long interview with her. And the interviewer asked the question, you know, how could Bonhoeffer have been involved in the conspiracy to kill Hitler? He started out his theological life as a pacifist. She talked about the language that was used among the family and the confessing church within their circle, that they believed Hitler was evil incarnate, that they called him a snake. And they believed the only way for this evil to stop with the persecution of the Jews and what was happening, particularly in the 1940s. Bonhoeffer did not get involved in that part of the resistance. And that is when in terms of the Holocaust and what was happening with the Jews. She said, we really believe we need to cut off the head of the snake. He believed that the work of church was to cast out and thwart evil. If the church follows Christ, the light of the world, into the world, then we will be given the power of Christ to discern darkness and evil. Evil for Bonhoeffer was not abstract. It worked in and through institutions as well as individuals. When religious and church institutions became more focused on their own preservation than preserving the dignity and life of human beings, then the church ceased to be the church due to its collusion with evil. For Bonhoeffer, this was a central problem of the German church. Throughout history, the gospel had been preached as an affront to evil social and cultural practices. It was a foundation for building a Christian social ethic, insisting on the human dignity of all persons and the fair share of economic resources, the sisterhood and the brotherhood, right, of all persons. However, church collusion with evil and the quietest tendencies was also and continues to be a perennial problem. Bonhoeffer insisted the church engage in the work of discerning evil in all the individual and corporate manifestations and engage in social justice. He became very critical of the German Christian, the larger church. A matter of fact, when there was an ecumenical conference in England, or this is in the early 30s, and they said, well, we'll invite representatives of the German Christian church and the confessing church. He said, no, the German Christians, even though Hitler had excommunicated the confessing church, he said, no, the German Christians are not the true Christian church of Jesus Christ. They shouldn't have any representatives at an ecumenical council. I'm going to quote from Eberhard Bethge, was one of his friends and was related to him by marriage, and also his biographer. And I think this is a really powerful small quote from Eberhard. People today who confine themselves to confession and never cross the threshold often ask how a man like Bonhoeffer could theologically justify his identification with the conspirators. The question is frightful because it's usually raised out of an isolating situation of detached confessionalism, unconscious of its own complicity with evil. My wife once gave the shortest answer. How can a confessing Christian theologically justify a lack of action? And so the great danger, and this has to do with the fifth lesson, the great danger for Bonhoeffer that the church was embodying of his day was then this confusion between the role of church and state. He believed then the gospel was being collapsed into a political ideology, and whenever that happens, that political ideology is going to trump the gospel. He outlines in a piece he writes, which is titled The Jewish Question, and this is something they called in their discussions at that time, the Jewish questions. They had, the Arian clause had just become law, which meant that if you were a pastor and you had any Jewish blood in you, you could no longer be a pastor in Germany. And there had to be you had to be pure. There was also the event of what we call Kristallnacht, which was the destruction of Jewish temples throughout Germany and the destruction of many Jewish businesses. So 1933, Hitler comes into even greater power as chancellor, and these events start really picking up against the Jews. So the Christian church was struggling in many different ways with this question of what are we to do? How are we to respond, right? So Bonhoeffer writes this piece called The Jewish Question, and he talks about 3 tasks that the church has. I think all of this really resonates, I believe, today for the church. The first one is the prophetic role of the church. The church must break silence when they know that there are evil practices happening. They must speak truth to power and be very careful about colluding with political power. The second, they must aid the victims of persecution, no matter what the cost is to themselves. Again, love means not the focus on the preserving of the church, but the call out into the world where Jesus works. So aiding victims. And the third one is political action. Luther used to talk about, it's fine to help the people at the bottom of a hill after a wagon has run over them, but maybe we should go at the top of the hill and put a spoke in the wheel so the wagon doesn't run over people. So Bonhoeffer brings that back into his writing and talks about we need to put a spoke in the wheel. Some of his sermons, you can almost imagine him yelling at people like, we need to help to stop what is going on here. That the role of the church is to be the conscience of the state. That there are boundaries between church and state, and he would argue, as Luther did, you need to stay within your boundaries, but when the state oversteps those boundaries, for example, by calling pastors not to have any Jewish blood in them, the church should rear up and say, oh, no, you cannot tell us who to have pastors and who not to have pastors, right? That is the role of the church, not the role of the state. So he talked about the state having allowing too much lawlessness and not interfering is one problem with the state, or there is not enough, that they're allowing too much chaos to go on in society and not intervening. That the church needs to speak up about these things and be the conscience of the state. Eberhard Bethge wrote, Bonhoeffer introduced us in 1935 to the problem what we today call political resistance. The levels of confession and resistance could no longer be kept neatly apart. The escalating persecution of the Jews generated an increasingly intolerable situation, especially for Bonhoeffer himself. We now realize that mere confession, no matter how courageous, inescapably meant complicity with the murderers, even though there would always be new acts of refusing to be co-opted, and even though we would preach Christ alone Sunday after Sunday. During the whole time, the Nazi state never considered it necessary to prohibit such preaching. Why should it? Thus, we were approaching the borderline between confession and resistance. And if we didn't cross this border, our confession was going to be no better than cooperation with criminals. And so it became clear what the problem lay for the confessing church. We were resisting by way of confession, but we were not confessing by way of resistance. And so I'll leave you with this, instead of 5 conclusions, 5 quick set of questions to reflect on in terms of what is all that the 1920s and 30s in Germany have to do for us today in terms of church response to what is going on in the world. And the first one has to do, remember, with our Christology, our understanding of who Jesus Christ is in the world today. What is our point of departure? Is it the gospel of Jesus Christ and his radical ethic of love? The second one, what's our relationship to culture in today's reality and social and political context? Are we detached from it all? Or are we subsumed under some political power and ideology, either on the left politically or on the right, where we confuse the gospel with our political ideology? Are we a distinct body of Christ engaged in the reality of our time? The third one having to do with love. Do we love the poor, the marginalized, and oppressed? How do we love? Is it our orientation one of humility? Do we listen carefully to the pleas and cries of the suffering of today? Are we actively engaged through solidarity and justice building? The fourth, evil. Do we recognize evil? And when we do we make bargains with evil systems? We'll just put up with it and it will all be okay. When we do recognize evil, do we act to preserve the church or achieve our good goals, or do we act for the other responsibly, as Bonhoeffer used the language of our freedom? We are given freedom from God only to act responsibly for the other. And the fifth one is the relationship of church and state. How do we as a church act as a conscience to the state? Do we speak a prophetic word? Do we aid victims? Do we put a spoke in the wheels that are running down people today? To what extent should we oppose government policies and join in solidarity with those that are marginalized today, with undocumented workers, with refugees, with those who are experiencing oppression, victims of violence and unfair practices? Bonhoeffer, in that my favorite sermon of his, the one I mentioned after the election of church leaders, it is not we who build. He builds the church. No human being builds the church but Christ alone. Whoever intends to build the church is surely well on the way to destroying it. For he will build a temple to idols without wishing it or knowing it. We must confess, he builds. We must proclaim, he builds. We must pray that he may build. We don't know his plan. We can't see whether he's building or pulling up or pulling down. It may be that one time, by our standards, our times of collapse are for him the greatest time of construction. It might that be, from our human point of view, great times for the church are actually times of demolition. It's a great comfort which Christ gives his church. Confess, preach, bear witness to me, and I will build. Don't meddle in what is my province. Do what is given to you to do well, and you have done enough, but do it well. Confess, 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 Christ builds. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. I'm sorry that time constraints aren't going to allow for a formal question and answer, but I think, Beth, you'll be willing to stay here and answer questions. Thank you for coming. We're proud of our faculty and the work they do, and thank you for sampling it with us.